So no doubt, many of you would have heard the expression, no man is an island. The idea being that we need each other, right? We're social beings. So to the extent that human beings can exist by themselves, it's been a thing where in evolutionary terms, it's never been that ever. And so this concept of individualism, yeah, is actually a lot more recent than one might think. So when we think about early humans, when we first started out, we started out in communities of about 30 to about 50. These people were, one way one could think of it is your family, your close friends, your extended family, etc. And this was kind of the general kind of communities that we used to live in. And even to today, like if you think about how many people you genuinely know on like a deeper level, it's roughly around that. Maybe for some people it's less, but it's unlikely to be more than that. Like kind of, you might have like 1,000 friends on Instagram, etc., etc. But in reality, how intricately do you know their lives and vice versa? In that regard, people we've always been social in that sense. But there's one thing for like survival, right? It's very, if we imagine like someone living on a desert island, and we think about the cost of doing such thing, right? We do understand that obviously there is a requirement to work together. It's that old thing that that the economist Milton Friedman used to say about no one in the whole world knows how to make a pencil, right? And this is, you know, this is the story of the pencil. In order to make even one pencil, you need someone who like is going to cut down the wood, and then where you're going to get the saw from, you're going to need to get metal from like the ground. Then you're going to need to, you know, it's a long process, and then you need to get rubber, and then you need to get like so, and then you need to dig out graphite and shit, you know. So no one person knows how to make a pencil. So in that regard, human beings need to work together. But the question with regard to individualism is not to say that we don't need people at all, because yeah, it's true, no man is an island. No one came here by themselves. No one was educated fully by themselves. No one was fed, etc., fully by themselves. Like there is no such thing as the fully independent like person living by themselves, like from start to finish throughout the course of their lives. And so in that regard, it's a thing where people do need each other, but it's a question of what value does the individual have in relation to the collective. The collective has its uses, but if the individual and the rights that are inherent within the individual are put to one side, then it's a thing of, can human society really elevate itself beyond this kind of basic survival stage? How can we get past that stage into a thing where we're reaching self-actualization as such, as a species? That's some of the things we're going to look into in this video. So up until 1820, people did not refer to human beings as individuals. The only time that people used the term individual was if they were talking about things like horses. This idea of the individual with relation to human beings is itself an incredibly modern concept. The term was first coined by two Frenchmen, Joseph de Maistre, Claude Henri Saint-Simon, and also a third one, Félicité Robert de Lemanez. Yeah, see, my pronunciation of French is still terrible. They used individualism in a critical sense. So when we think about different societies, we have to think that different societies have different core values. Well, society itself doesn't have values. The people within those societies have values, right? Because people make society. What one tends to find is that a lot of the thinkers that came from France, because of the legacy of like, you know, of French history as such, being relatively more autocratic than you would see across the channel, it is a thing where individualism was first coined as a critique. It was basically equating it with anarchy. It was basically saying that if we delineate ourselves like from this collective, if we kind of segment ourselves into tiny little like atomized particles and stuff, right, then it's a thing where actually the entire species breaks down, stuff, the entire social structure breaks down, because if everyone's just interested just in themselves, then it means that actually like there's no cohesion in society, there's no direction, there's no kind of order. The theory was that actually if you had individualism, the entire society would break down. It wasn't actually until you had the word itself reach more Protestant countries. Now, what I mean by this is this: when we think about medieval Christendom was centered in Rome, and the Pope said what was what. With regard to the Reformation, you started to have a real opening up of people being like, actually,
It's for us as individuals to interpret the word of God. Where did this kind of idea even come from? The concept of like man being created in God's image and therefore having the autonomy to interpret scripture in one's own way. That, is a very revolutionary kind of thing, right? We tended to find these in Protestant nations because you already had this Reformation, you already had this explosion of people with different ideas, different interpretations of how to interpret like kind of Christian doctrine. What we find is that as opposed to France, to places like Germany, places like Britain, places like America, individualism takes on a very different meaning and a lot more positive meaning. So in Germany, it takes on a romantic take because it's tied in with German romanticism. The intrinsic kind of like value of the individual kind of like, well, particularly the individual German. In Britain, and also like, and even more so in America, the term individualism becomes really tied in with kind of economic and social freedom. Yeah, so it's the right of the individual to do what he or she wishes. Yeah, so long as it doesn't harm someone else. And this concept of I'm gonna be able to set up my own business. Yeah, I'm gonna run it my way. I'm gonna pay people what like kind of what etc. All this kind of stuff, right? It rewards people for taking private initiative, yeah? So they're not waiting about for government bureaucrats to say what can and cannot be done. It's a thing of, through their own like intuition, through their own ingenuity, through their own creativity, they are going to take the initiative and they are the ones who are going to take the risk, and they might fail, but they also might succeed. And it's the freedom of the individual to take those risks, which we're going to look into here. So now we're going to start talking about the Enlightenment period. And this was a time at which, what we start to think of as kind of liberal, like modern liberal kind of like thought really coming together as succinct ideas, right? And in the same year of the Declaration of Independence for America, that's when Adam Smith, the famous economist from Scotland, wrote his book, The Wealth of Nations. In another book he wrote called Moral Sentiments, he outlines very clearly this idea of this invisible hand of the market. He's the person who came up with the idea of the division of labor. He's the first kind of really like classical liberal, like kind of like economist that we can kind of think of, right? And many of the things that he was arguing for is that actually the greater good is done when individuals are able to pursue their own self-interest, yeah? So the candlestick maker, the baker, the butcher, etc. I think I've got that in the wrong order, whatever. These people are not going out for the good of their community necessarily. Yeah, people don't set up businesses to be like, oh, I want to help my community. Maybe some people do, right? But by and large, it's for their own self-profit, right? People do things for profit. The society is benefited by the entrepreneurs, by the business people who have these things, because that's where we get our products from. This is where we get new innovations from. This is where we get the supplies of our bare necessities from as well. By people pursuing their own self-interest, like by having the thing of I want to be rich, or I want to at least very least be well off, it means that people go, actually, right, we now have more options because people are now incentivized to set up their own shops, which means that there's competition, which means that we the consumers all benefit. So the whole society benefits from people as individuals pursuing their own individual things. And the same thing works with employment as well. You are looking for a job, you working in that job is benefiting people because you're providing a service for people that's valued, and so you're getting paid. You go to that job, you might enjoy it, you might not enjoy it, but either way, you're getting something in reward for that, right? You're getting wages, right? But if everyone was like, no, I don't want to do that, right? Like if we had a society where people didn't have to work for wages, how many jobs would necessarily be done? Not to say that no one would go to work at all, but a large segment of the population, probably the majority, would be like, actually, why am I going to do this if there's no reward for me, right? And you can say, oh, for the good of the community, and there'll be some people who are so altruistic that they would like continue working for the good of their wider community, but the vast majority of people would not do that. So people pursuing their own individual like interests, that's what furthers society. And this then later ties in with what Jeremy Bentham was saying, which is this idea of utilitarianism, which is that
actually what we want to do is create a society which benefits the most for the people as a whole, right? It serves people's individual interests as much as possible. The greatest good that can possibly be done is what ought to be done. So if something only serves the interest of like a tiny group of people, then it's not good, right? You want to have the policy which, broadly speaking, will benefit the most people, the vast majority of people. With this idea of individualism, you get two different competing opponents to it, yeah? One being the more socially conservative types, right? So people like Edmund Burke, who criticised individualism by saying it would lead to hedonism, it would lead to people like just engaging in their own like base interests, yeah, whether that be drugs, whether that be sex, whether that be whatever, right? The whole society would completely disintegrate if you allowed this to kind of run amok, right? And that actually what you needed was a bit more of an orderly society, and so this is where the constant debate between liberalism and conservatism comes into it in terms of, and this is something we discussed in previous videos, so definitely check those out. So there's the socially conservative argument with regard to it in terms of having things atomized breaks down social order and leads to chaos. The other argument against individualism tends to come more from what we've described as the political left, right? So this idea that actually you didn't start your own business, you didn't start like you needed government roads, you needed government schools, government this, right? So people all coming together as a society, right? So through the state, that's how the society. So if we think about it in these terms, right? I believe that one of the biggest debates, which are at the core of like kind of our Western understanding of liberal democracies, is this, right? What is at the centre of society? Is it the state and the collective, or is it the individual? So if the society is centred around the state, then everything must be orientated in that way. If everything is centered around the collective and what serves the collective interest, then it will lead to a certain set of policies, yeah? If, however, the society believes that the individual is sovereign and that the individual is the foundational blocks within the society and that everything else must emanate from that, yeah? So it starts with the individual, then the family, then the community, then the nation, right? So having this bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach, right? This is part of the big debate about how should we actually govern ourselves? How should we run our societies? Like, should individualism be held up to a higher thing or should it not be? And you can see this now with the debate with regard to how best to tackle the current like kind of pandemic that we're all going through, right? A collectivist approach would say, actually, we all have to work together as a society, we have to like put money in our NHS, we have to do this, we have to do that, raise taxes, etc., and we have to worry about what everyone else is doing, we have to fine people if they don't wear masks, we have to fine people if they do this, and everything's focused on what everyone else in society is doing. Whereas an individualist approach would be, actually, I as an individual have certain health risks. I'm going to do to minimize that is I'm going to wear a mask, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it. So by us taking care of ourselves, right, as individuals, if everyone did that for our society, so the argument goes, then we would actually end up with a much better result, which would have far less negative externalities, i.e. bad, unforeseen like kind of effects, right, like side effects. So having a top-down approach ends up oftentimes being very inefficient, very clumsy, ends up leading to a lot of problems that we didn't foresee, and that actually sometimes having a more individualist approach can better deal with these bigger problems, because individualism says that it all starts with the individual, right? Like, we can't try and fix the world if we're not taking care of ourselves. It's as Jesus said, take the splint out of your own eye before taking it out of your brother's, right? The idea that actually you need to worry about what you're doing before trying to help others, before worrying about how society should be run, maybe worry about how your own life should be run and what you can do to improve it. Because if everyone had that attitude of how can I improve my life insofar as it doesn't hurt other people, then we'd all live in a much better world. As we start getting further and further, like kind of like towards the present day, we start to have philosophers such as Nietzsche, right, who really criticized collectivism and criticized this kind of, because he basically said that it was basically us all going through like a herd mentality, right, that we're all basically like cattle. If you have collectivism, that everyone must follow a certain path, right, and no one actually stops and thinks as an individual of what the best course is to take. As this ends up going into the 20th century, we start to have thinkers of the more like libertarian right persuasion, such as Rand, who, she like really big advocate for individualism, and said that the question is not what is the meaning of life. The question is, what is the meaning of your life, right? And having this idea that you are responsible, that you have to take care of your own life. She even went a step further. She said that actually altruism, caring about others, and putting the needs of others above yourself, is actually a moral evil. This is the argument that she made. What Ayn Rand was trying to say, and what many other libertarian thinkers were trying to say, and this is again why you need to check out the video History on Libertarianism, as well as many other videos that cover these topics. You see this idea that actually, if the individual focuses on themselves, then the whole wider society is helped. This ties up with like a famous quote by Margaret Thatcher, which often ends up getting like misquoted. She said, "There's no such thing as society," and normally that people go, "Stop the presses." That's the quote in itself. But what she went on to say was this: "There's no such thing as society. There are only individuals and families." Right? So that's a little bit different when you have the whole quote. It's basically saying that actually society doesn't exist. Society is this idea that's out there, right? But actually what society is individuals and families coming together and working together building a community and working together. And this is how we actually build a nation. This is what the nation is, and this is how we govern ourselves. It's from the bottom up. It's grassroots, right? So these are the arguments being made typically on the right, but whether it's left or right, I think that this is quite it's a very strongly libertarian stance. The authoritarian stance is this collectivism, is this top-down approach, but the libertarian approach is this idea of the bottom up.